I later learned that the senator was aware of his tendency to speak in cryptic fragments, joking that as the youngest of 9 children, he'd never had a chance to complete a sentence. To correct the problem, he'd consulted a psychologist who prescribed a daily therapeutic regimen to make him sound more intelligible when he wasn't using a prepared text. But he quickly lost interest in the therapy and kept on ahhing and awing with no noticeable improvement. As we talked, I was struck by the fact that Ted didn't look at Joan. Their eyes never met. Indeed, they didn't even bother with the casual intimacies that are common between husband and wife. Although I didn't know it at the time, Joan was well on her way to becoming a full-blown alcoholic. If Ted had once counted on Joan to turn a blind eye to his infidelities, her alcoholism had changed all that. Instead of tranquilizing her and making her more submissive, drink had freed Joan to speak her mind. She had recently given an indiscreet interview to the Ladies' Home Journal. She and Ted, she said, know our good and bad traits. We have seen one another at rock bottom. It was clear that Joan's tendency to talk about Ted in less than glowing terms had put a strain on their marriage. The tragedy of Chappaquiddick had only made matters worse. After our brief chat on Monhegan Island, 10 years passed before I ran into Ted Kennedy again. This time, it was at a Christmas party given by his sister-in-law, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, at her Fifth Avenue penthouse apartment. Ted was still recovering from his ill-fated primary race against President Jimmy Carter. A month or so before Jackie's cocktail reception, Carter had been soundly defeated by Ronald Reagan in the general election, which must have given Ted Kennedy a feeling of schadenfreude. It also might have accounted for the high spirits he displayed that December evening at Jackie's. Ted had gained a good deal of weight, and there were strands of gray in his thick mass of disordered hair. I had heard rumors that he and Joan were living apart, and in fact he'd come to the party without her. Joan's absence was particularly conspicuous because other members of Jackie's extended family, including her mother, her stepbrother, and assorted Kennedys, Shrivers, Lawfords, and Smiths, were present. So were a few favored writers and journalists who, like me, had been befriended by Jackie. "Teddy," Jackie said as she introduced us, "this is Ed Klein. He used to be at Newsweek, and now he's the editor of the New York Times Magazine." "The senator and I have met before," I said. "You were visiting Jamie and Phyllis Wyeth on Monhegan Island." "Oh, yes. I remember that, day, well," he said. But he was slurring his words and speaking more loudly than necessary, and I concluded that he'd had too much to drink. Still, it was interesting to note that, even when inebriated, Ted Kennedy displayed impeccable manners. He had not yet turned 50, and could still hold his liquor. Again, a decade or so went by before I met Ted Kennedy for the 3rd time. It was the early 1990s, and I'd left the Times after 11 years as editor of its Sunday magazine and was now writing for Vanity Fair and Parade. I'd been invited as the sole journalist to attend a private dinner given by a group of wealthy contributors in honor of Senator Kennedy at the 21 Club, a Manhattan mecca for top business executives and Wall Street bankers. Ted was preparing for a re-election campaign, and although he'd established a record as one of the Senate's all-time greats, he'd had a hand in passing every major health, education, and civil rights bill over the past 30 years. He was in serious political trouble back home in Massachusetts. As a result of his entanglement in the sordid Palm Beach rape case against his nephew, William Kennedy Smith, Ted's poll numbers had sunk to an all-time low. It looked as though the unthinkable might happen. A Kennedy might actually lose a race in Massachusetts. He loved the Senate, and he intended to fight with every weapon at his disposal to keep his seat. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, had once famously said, "Politics is like war. It takes 3 things to win. The first is money, and the second is money, and the third is money." Ted Kennedy had come to that night's dinner to raise a lot of money. He was now 60 years old.